want you to think of the last time you stood in the flour aisle at the grocery store. Really think about it. There you were, cart parked crooked in the middle of the aisle, looking at a wall of paper bags that all looked more or less the same. All-purpose, bread flour, self-rising, whole wheat, something called 00 that sounded like it belonged in a math class, not a kitchen, and not one of those bags told you which one was going to give you the loaf you had in your head. I know what happened to a lot of you after that. You grabbed one, probably the cheapest one or the one closest to your hand, brought it home, followed a recipe you found online, and pulled something out of the oven that didn't look anything like the picture. Maybe it was flat. Maybe it was so dense you could have used it as a doorstop. Maybe it rose up beautiful in the oven and then sank right back down into a sad little puddle the second you took it out, and you stood there in your kitchen wondering what you did wrong. Here's the thing, dear. You probably didn't do anything wrong with your hands. You did something wrong with your flour, and nobody ever sat you down and told you the difference. That's not a knock on you. That's just a gap. Flour companies aren't exactly falling over themselves to explain protein content to you in plain English. They'd rather you just buy the bag and hope for the best. By the end of this video, that guessing is going to be over for good. You are going to know exactly what every major bag of flour in that aisle is actually for, why it behaves the way it does in your hands and in your oven, and which one to reach for depending on what you're baking. No more grabbing whatever's closest. No more wondering why your bread came out wrong when you followed the recipe exactly. You'll walk into that store a different woman than you walked in today. I'm Rosalie Jean, and I have been baking bread in my own kitchen for more than 50 years now. Nobody ever handed me a culinary degree. What I have is a lifetime of hands in dough, going all the way back to standing on a little wooden stool next to my mother's counter, and every single kind of flour mistake you can make, I have made myself, more than once. So when I tell you something about flour, I'm not reciting it off the back of a bag. I lived it, usually the hard way. And stick with me all the way through, because near the end I'm going to give you a little trick for what to do if you're halfway through a recipe and realize you don't have the right flour in the house. It saved me more than one Sunday. Now, before we go bag by bag, I want to teach you the one idea that makes every single thing after this make sense. Once you understand this, you will never look at a bag of flour the same way again. Here it is. The single biggest difference between one flour and another is how much protein is in it. That's it. That's the secret nobody tells you. Every bag of flour has a protein percentage printed right there on the nutrition label, and that little number is basically the whole story of how your bread is going to behave. Here's why that number matters so much. When flour gets wet and you work it with your hands, those proteins link up and form something called gluten. Gluten is just a stretchy, elastic web that forms inside your dough. Think of it like a net made of rubber bands, all tangled up together. When your yeast breathes out little bubbles of gas as it works, that gluten net is what catches those bubbles and holds on to them, so your loaf puffs up instead of just going flat. More protein in the flour means a stronger, stretchier gluten net, which means your dough can trap more gas and hold its shape, which gives you that chewy, satisfying bite you get from a good, crusty loaf of bread. Less protein means a weaker, softer net, which can't hold as much gas, which is exactly what you want for something tender and delicate, like a cake or a biscuit, but is exactly what you don't want for a loaf of bread that needs to stand up tall. Here's the line I want you to remember, the one you could repeat to a friend standing next to you at the store. Protein makes the promise, and gluten keeps it. Say that to yourself next time you're staring at that wall of bags, and you'll already know more than most people who've been baking for years. All right, Let's go through the flours, one at a time, the way I'd walk you through them myself if we were standing in that aisle together. The first one, and the one most of you already have a bag of sitting in your pantry right now, is all-purpose flour. This is the flour that got its name, honestly, because it really can do a little bit of everything, and that's exactly why it confuses people. All-purpose flour usually sits somewhere around 10 to 12% protein, depending on the brand, which puts it right in the middle of the road. Not high enough to give you a truly chewy, structured bread loaf, and not low enough to give you the most tender, delicate cake you could make. It's the flour equivalent of a good, reliable sedan. It'll get you most places just fine. I'll tell you where all-purpose flour trips people up the most, and this is the mistake I see over and over. Folks use it for a crusty artisan-style loaf, the kind with a thick, crackling crust and an open, chewy inside, and then they wonder why their loaf came out a little flat and a little soft instead of that bold, chewy bite they were after. It's not that all-purpose flour is bad, it's that it's doing its honest best with a job it wasn't really built for. You can absolutely make a decent sandwich loaf with all-purpose flour, and I have plenty of times when that's all I had in the house. But if you want that real bakery-style chew, all-purpose flour is going to give you a softer, gentler version of it, not the real thing. The second flour, and the one I want every single one of you to have in your pantry if you're serious about bread, is bread flour. Bread flour usually runs somewhere between 12 and 14% protein, sometimes a touch higher depending on the brand. That extra protein compared to all-purpose flour might not sound like much on paper, but let me tell you, in your hands, you can feel the difference the moment you start kneading it. Bread flour dough feels stronger, it feels stretchier, it pushes back against you a little bit, almost like it's got some muscle in it. That extra strength is exactly what gives you that satisfying chew in a good loaf of bread, and it's also what lets your dough hold its shape when it's rising, instead of spreading out flat across the pan. I remember the first time I really understood this. I must have been about 22 years old, newly married, trying to bake my late husband a proper loaf of bread, the way my mother used to make. I used all-purpose flour because that's what I had, and I followed her recipe to the letter, and the loaf came out looking more like a big flat biscuit than a proud loaf of bread. I called my mother in tears, practically, and she asked me one question. She said, "Dear, is that bread flour or the regular kind?" I didn't even know there was a difference until that phone call. The next week, I bought a bag of bread flour, made the exact same recipe, changed nothing else, and that loaf stood up tall and proud with a crust that crackled when I tapped it. Same recipe, same hands, different flour. That's how much this matters. If you only ever buy one specialty flour after watching this video, let it be bread flour. It is the single biggest upgrade most home bakers can make without changing a single other thing about their recipe. The third flour I want to walk you through is whole wheat flour, and this one behaves differently enough that it deserves its own careful explanation. Whole wheat flour is milled from the entire wheat kernel, which means it includes the bran, which is the tough outer coating, and the germ, which is the nutrient-rich little core of the seed. All-purpose and bread flour, by contrast, are milled from just the soft inner part of the kernel, which is why they're that pale, almost white color, while whole wheat flour is that heartier tan brown you're used to seeing. Here's what that bran and germ do to your dough, and this is the part nobody explains clearly. Those little bits of bran are sharp on a microscopic level, almost like tiny shards, and as your dough kneads and rises, those sharp bits actually cut through some of the gluten strands as they form. That means whole wheat dough, even with a good strong protein percentage, ends up with a weaker gluten structure than white bread flour, simply because the bran is slicing through the very net that's supposed to be holding everything together. That's why whole wheat loaves tend to come out denser and shorter than white bread flour loaves, even when you follow the exact same recipe. Whole wheat flour also soaks up more water than white flour does because that bran is thirsty. If you take a recipe written for bread flour and swap in whole wheat flour cup for cup without adjusting anything else, you'll often end up with a dry, crumbly dough that just won't come together properly. My rule of thumb, the one my own mother taught me, is that whenever you're substituting whole wheat flour into a recipe built for white flour, add a little extra liquid, usually starting around 2 extra tablespoons for every 3 cups of flour, and adjust from there by feel until the dough feels soft and slightly tacky, not stiff and dry. Now here's my honest caveat, the one I promised you I'd give you somewhere in this video, because I don't believe in overselling anything to you. If you take a recipe and swap in 100% whole wheat flour, replacing every bit of the white flour, you are going to get a noticeably denser, heavier loaf than the airy sandwich bread you might be picturing in your head. That's not a mistake. That's just what whole wheat does. There's nothing wrong with that loaf, and it's wonderful in its own hearty way, especially toasted with a little butter. But if you're expecting that light, fluffy white sandwich bread texture, 100% whole wheat isn't going to give you that, no matter how carefully you handle it. A lot of bakers, myself included, like to split the difference and use half whole wheat and half bread flour, which gives you that hearty flavor and the nutrition of whole wheat, along with a lighter texture than going all the way whole wheat would give you. The fourth flour I want to cover is rye flour, and I'll tell you right now, this one gives people the most trouble, and it gave me trouble too, for years. Rye flour comes from an entirely different grain than wheat, and it simply doesn't form gluten the same way wheat flour does, no matter how long you knead it or how hard you work it. Rye has plenty of protein in it, but that protein doesn't link up into the same strong, stretchy gluten web that wheat protein does. On top of that, rye flour is full of something called pentosans, which are a type of fiber that soaks up an enormous amount of water and makes rye dough feel sticky, heavy, and almost gluey compared to wheat dough. My grandmother on my mother's side used to make a rye bread every fall that I still think about. Dense, dark, almost a little sour, the kind of bread you'd slice thin and eat with butter and a little salt. When I tried to recreate it as a young woman using pure rye flour and nothing else, following what I thought was her recipe, it came out so heavy and gummy in the middle that you could have used a slice of it as a paperweight. It took me years, and eventually a very patient letter back and forth with an aunt, to learn that her rye bread was never 100% rye flour. It was always cut with a good amount of bread flour, usually somewhere around 1/3 rye to 2/3 bread flour, which gave the loaf that deep, distinctive rye flavor while still letting the wheat flour's gluten do the heavy lifting of actually holding the loaf together and letting it rise properly. Here's where most people go wrong with rye flour, and I want to be very clear about this because it trips up even confident bakers. If a recipe calls for rye flour and doesn't specify blending it with a wheat flour, and you're a newer baker, be a little suspicious of that recipe, or at least know going in that your loaf is going to be dense and low, almost like a very hearty flatbread, rather than a tall, airy sandwich loaf. That's simply the nature of rye. It's not that you did anything wrong with your hands. Rye flour on its own was never going to give you a tall, fluffy loaf, no matter whose hands were kneading it. The fifth flour, and this one surprises people because they don't even think of it as being in the bread family at all, is Durum flour, sometimes labeled as Semolina flour depending on how finely it's ground. This one comes from a different variety of wheat than your standard loaf flours, and it's got a lovely golden color and a protein content that can run quite high, sometimes touching 14 or 15%. You'll mostly see it used for pasta, and it truly is wonderful for that, but there's a whole tradition, especially in parts of southern Italy, of using durum flour, often blended with regular bread flour, to make a beautiful golden, dense crumbed bread with a slightly nutty, almost sweet flavor. If you've never tried baking with it, I'd encourage you to pick up a small bag sometime and blend it about 1 part durum to 3 parts bread flour in your favorite loaf recipe. It won't behave exactly like a pure bread flour loaf. The crumb will be a touch tighter and the color a beautiful pale gold. But it's a lovely change of pace once you've got your basic bread flour loaf down with confidence. The sixth and final flour I want to walk you through is cake and pastry flour, and I'm including this one mostly so you understand why it will never, under any circumstances, make you a good loaf of bread, no matter how much you might be tempted to use up that half a bag sitting in your cupboard. Cake flour sits down around 7 to 9% protein, sometimes even lower. That's a soft, delicate, low-protein flour, milled extra fine, and it is absolutely wonderful for what it's meant for, which is tender cakes, soft biscuits, and delicate pastries where you want a light, crumbly texture rather than any real chew. But remember our rule: protein makes the promise and gluten keeps it. Cake flour simply doesn't have enough protein to form the strong gluten net that bread needs to trap gas and rise up tall. If you tried to bake a loaf of bread with cake flour, even with plenty of yeast and a long rise, you'd end up with something that barely rose at all, and what did rise would likely collapse the moment it came out of the oven, because there just isn't enough structural strength in that flour to hold a tall loaf up. Keep cake flour in the cake and pastry drawer of your mind, and keep bread flour in the bread drawer, and you'll save yourself a very sad flat loaf someday. Now, I promised you a little trick, and here it is, the one that saved me on more than one busy Sunday when I've started a recipe and realized halfway through that I'm out of bread flour. If you find yourself in that spot with only all-purpose flour in the house, you can give it a boost that gets it closer to bread flour's protein strength. For every cup of all-purpose flour a recipe calls for, take out about 1½ teaspoons of the flour and replace it with 1½ teaspoons of pure vital wheat gluten, which is just concentrated wheat protein you can find in the baking aisle. It's not going to be a perfect match for true bread flour, and I won't pretend it is, but it closes the gap enough that your loaf will hold its shape and chew far better than plain all-purpose flour would on its own. It's gotten me out of more than one tight spot. Let's bring this all the way home now and talk about what actually knowing this does for you. Before I understood any of this, I wasted flour, I wasted yeast, and I wasted whole afternoons on loaves that never should have failed in the first place, simply because I was reaching for the wrong bag without knowing any better. If you think about the cost of a failed loaf, and I mean the real cost, the flour, the yeast, the butter, the eggs if your recipe called for them, plus the better part of an afternoon you'll never get back, a single failed attempt can easily run you somewhere around $4 or $5 in ingredients alone, and that's before you count your time as worth anything at all. Multiply that by however many disappointing loaves you've made over the years without knowing why they went wrong, and you start to see real money and real hours slipping away, all because nobody ever explained a simple little number printed right there on the bag. Once you know which flour does which job, that waste mostly disappears. You reach for bread flour when you want that proud, chewy loaf. You reach for whole wheat when you want that heartier, more filling slice, and you know to expect a shorter loaf and you plan for it instead of being surprised by it. You know cake flour never belongs anywhere near a bread recipe, and you know rye flour needs a wheat flour partner if you want anything but a dense, low loaf. That's not just money saved, that's confidence, real confidence, the kind where you walk into your kitchen knowing your loaf is going to come out right, instead of crossing your fingers and hoping. And I'll tell you, there is nothing quite like the moment when you pull a proper, tall, golden loaf out of your oven, one you built on purpose instead of by accident, and your family comes wandering into the kitchen asking what that smell is, and then asking for a slice before it's even properly cooled. That's worth more than any dollar figure I could give you. Here's your homework this week, and I want you to actually do it, not just nod along and move on to the next video. Go to your pantry right now, or the next time you're at the store, and find the protein percentage on whatever bag of flour you've got. Then pick one recipe you've made before that didn't turn out quite the way you wanted, and make it again this week using the correct flour for the job, based on everything we just talked about. That's it. One recipe, one correction, see what happens. And while you're at it, I'd love to know something from you down in the comments. Tell me what kind of bread your own family always made growing up, and what flour they used to make it, if you remember. I read every single one of these comments myself. Every one, and I love hearing about the breads that came before us in everybody's own kitchens. Next time, I'm going to show you the one proofing mistake that's probably been holding your loaves back this whole time. The kind of thing that can take a decent loaf and turn it into something truly special. And it costs you absolutely nothing extra to fix. Until then, dear, keep your hands a little floury, keep your flour bag matched to your dream loaf, and never be afraid to start over when a bake doesn't go your way. This is Rosalie Jean, and I'll see you in the kitchen next time.